We worship him. Morning, everybody. I hope y'all are having a pretty good weekend so far. I don't know, the weather's just been wonderful. Friday was I woke up to like a big old storm and I thought, oh gosh, it's going to be a pretty miserable weekend. And then, Saturday came around and looking out the window today, it looks like it's just another beautiful day. And I know I'm grateful for that. So please forgive me. I've kind of going over a cold right now. So if I cough or anything, please just bear with me. So the title of my lesson today, I'm calling it Burnout. And before I get any further into it, as we've done many times in the past, please stand as I read some scripture. I'll be reading from Matthew chapter 11, verses 28 through 30. It says, "Come to me, all who labor and are weary, heavy laden, and I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you and learn from me, for I am gentle and lowly in heart, and you will find rest in your souls. For my yoke is easy and my burden is light." All right, y'all, please be seated. So I'd like to kind of start my lesson by first describing what I'm talking about when I'm saying burnt out. And I'm talking more in the emotional sense. So in the dictionary defines it as the physical or mental collapse caused by overwork or stress. And I was thinking about that, but lately, especially in the past few years, there's been a lot of stress going on in the world. We just recently have gone through a pandemic and it's still lingering in some regards. The news is always talking about a war going on in one place or another. The prices for everyday goods seems to be just going up and up. Eggs, for example, it just never seems to go back down. And even in our own personal lives, trying to balance the stresses of work and even the stresses back at home. And, as we're still getting over things like the pandemic and, all this talk of war and, just inflation and balancing everything, I want to let you know that, this feeling of just being overwhelmed and just stressed and just like, man, I need a vacation, or you know what, I just want to quit. It's not new, and it's actually addressed in the Bible before. And there are two cases or two individuals that I'd really like to focus on this lesson today when I'm talking about stress. And the first person I'd like to talk about is the story of Elijah. Now, Elijah's story starts in 1 Kings chapter 17, and his story ends in 2 Kings chapter 2. And Elijah does a lot in the beginning. In 1 Kings 17:1, he declares a drought. He goes to King Ahab and he says that there's going to be a drought. In verses, continuing in 17, verses 8 through 16, one of the first miracles that he's a part of is while during this drought, he stays with a widow and they're able to eat abundantly. The next miracle that he's a part of, and this is the first time it ever happens in the Bible, is that he's part of raising the dead. Now, this is a feat that only 4 other people have ever done in the Bible, and he's the first one. And I don't know about y'all, but if I was Elijah and I was the first one to be part of this miracle, the dead coming back to life, I would be pretty confident that I'm following the right God. And then the last main point story in Elijah that I'd like to go, or that I'll be going over, is his confrontation on Mount Carmel. Now I'll be quoting some scripture from the Old Testament, and many of y'all are familiar. Some of these words are a little tricky to pronounce, so please bear with me on that part. But first, I'd like to start with chapter 18, where the Lord goes to Elijah and he says the following. starting in verses 1 and 2. After many days, the word of the Lord came to Elijah, and in the third year, saying, saying, Go, show yourself to Ahab, and I will send rain upon the earth. So Elijah went to show himself to Ahab, and now the famine was severe in Samaria. And this drought, this famine, lasted for about 3 years. And during these 3 years, at first, God had sent ravens to provide Elijah with, all the food and bread that he would need. And eventually, he would go to a widow. And, before I get that, I'm jumping ahead of myself here. In 1 Kings 18, verses 17 through 19, it says, when Ahab saw Elijah, Ahab said to him, Isn't it you, troubler of Israel? And he answered, I have not troubled Israel, but you have, and your father's house, because you have abandoned the commandments of the Lord, and followed the Baals. Now, therefore, send and gather all of Israel to me at Mount Carmel, and the prophets of Baal, and the 400 prophets of Azerah to eat at Jezebel's table. Sorry, I think some of the slides are missing here. My apologies. No worries, I got notes. But so before we get to Elijah confronting King Ahab, in verses Oh, yeah. I'm sorry. I definitely am missing some slides here, but it's all right. So during this time of the drought, Elijah goes to a widow, and in chapter 17, sorry. Here we go. So in chapter 17, I'll just stick with this slide here. Starting in verse 8, so Elijah goes to this widow, and this widow is actually prepared to make one last meal. Elijah goes to her and says, hey, can you let me stay with you for a little while? Let me stay with you and, share some of the food you have. And the widow's initial response is to say, hey, I'm sorry, but I don't have enough food for you. I'm actually getting ready to make one last meal for my son and I, and we're going to starve to death during this time of the drought. And after this time, and Elijah responds and says, do not fear. Go and do as I say go do as you have said. But first, make me a little cake of it and bring it to me. And afterwards, make something for yourself and your son. For thus the Lord, the God of Israel, the jar of flour shall not be spent, and the jug of oil shall not be empty, until the day that the Lord sends rain upon the earth. And she went and did as Elijah said, and she did, and she and he and her household ate for many days. The jar of flour was not spent, neither did the jug of oil become empty, according to the word of the Lord that he spoke by Elijah. And so during this time of the drought, everyone's going through this stress of, well, hey, I'm not eating enough. I don't know if I'll survive this time. And this kind of reminds me of recently through the pandemic. There was this moment where many of us probably lost our jobs or weren't getting paid because we were told to stay home. Many people were scared about what were we going to do in the aftermath, or how are we going to get over this? And fortunately, we're all still here. So just like how God had provided for Elijah and the widow, God also provided for us. And they were all still very stressed during this time, during this drought. And afterwards, in verse 17, the widow's son grows ill and he dies. Now, when the widow's son dies, Elijah takes the boy up to his room and he prays to God 3 times. And he asks God to bring the son back, and he does. So again, we've all had to deal with these losses of stress in our lives where many of us are just, like we've lost loved ones due to COVID. And we're just uncertain as to how things go. And then Elijah, he has this, he's part of this miracle where it's just, oh, shoot. Oh, I'm sorry. But so Elijah has done this miracle where a boy is brought back to life. And after this, now in 1 Kings chapter 18, 1 and 2, it said, after many days, the word of the Lord came to Elijah in the 3rd year, saying, go, show yourself to Ahab, and I will send rain upon the earth. So Elijah went to show himself to Ahab, and now the famine was pretty severe in Samaria. Remember, a lot of people were prepared to starve and die from this famine. And in verse 8, it doesn't look like it's coming back on the screen. So if y'all want to turn your Bibles, please follow along in 1 Kings chapter 18, verses 8 through 16. It says, and then the word of the Lord came to him, go at once to Zarephath in the region of Sidon and stay there. I have directed a widow there to supply you food. So he went to Zarephath, and he came to the town gate, and the widow was there gathering sticks. He called her and asked, would you bring me a little water in the jar so that I have a drink? Sorry, I think my slides got a little mixed out of order than how I planned. Okay, so now in 1 Kings chapter 18, verses 17 through 19, it says, when Ahab saw Elijah, Ahab said to him, it is you who troubler of Israel. And he answered, I have not troubled Israel, but you have, and your father's house, because you have abandoned the commandments of the Lord, and followed the Baals. Now, therefore, send and gather all Israel to me at Mount Carmel, and the 450 prophets of Baal, and the 400 prophets of Asherah, who eat at Jezebel's table. So that's pretty intimidating and stressful already. We just went through a drought, and God's telling Elijah, hey, you're going to go up to the king and tell him that all this is because you decided to follow a false god, a false prophet. And it's already intimidating enough where the idea that there are 450 prophets of this Baal guy, and then there's just Elijah just standing there, just him alone. And many times I personally have been in situations where I felt like I'm the only Christian and everybody else doesn't seem to worship God. And sometimes we can kind of give into that pressure where it's just, well, maybe I'm following the wrong God. And I'm sure that Elijah was probably thinking something similar, even though some of these miracles had just happened. The dead came back to life. And yet here is 450 other people who says our God is better. So Elijah was pretty intimidated at this time. And in verses 22 through 18, it says, then Elijah said to the people, even I only am left, a prophet of the Lord, but Baal's prophets are 450. Let 2 bulls be given to us, and let them choose 1 bull to themselves, and cut it into pieces, and lay it on the wood. But put no fire to it, and I will prepare the the other bowl, and I lay it on the wood, and put no fire to it. And you call upon the name of your God, and I will call upon the name of the Lord. And the God who answers by fire, he is God. And the people answered, it is well spoken. So Elijah goes to the king and he says, let's have a contest. We'll have 2 altars, and who's ever God can light, the altar on fire, he's the real God. And again, this is pretty intimidating. You have 450 men all willing and ready to say, hey, you're wrong, I'm right, and here you are alone. And the pressure's on him. And so moving on to verse 26 through 28, it says, and they took the bull that was given to them, and they prepared it and called it up on the name of Baal from morning till noon, saying, O Baal, answer us. But there was no voice, and no one answered. And they limped around the altar that they made. And at noon, Elijah mocked them, saying, cry out loud, for he is a god. Either he is musing, or he is relieving himself, or he is just on a journey, or perhaps he is asleep and must be awakened. And they cried aloud and cut themselves after their custom with swords and lances, until the blood gushed out upon them. And as midday passed, they raved until the time of the offering of the oblation. But there was no voice, no one answered, and no one paid attention. So they just started this contest, and the prophets of Baal had created their altar. These 450 people all screaming and praising to their God, asking to light this tribute on fire. And Isaiah kind of notices this, and he starts to get a little bit of confidence. And he sees that, maybe you guys just, what? I know what it is. Your God he's thinking about it. He doesn't know if he wants to light this cow on fire. Or you know what? I bet you he's in the bathroom. Oh, no, you know what? He went out of town. He'll come back. Don't worry. Oh, I get it. He forgot to set his alarm clock. And to have that kind of confidence, to just be standing there in front of 400 people saying that, you know what? Your guy just forgot to set the alarm. No worries. He'll be here. I know it, right? He's a real God. And he starts getting this sort of excitement, this like, wow, okay, I did pick the right team, go underdogs. And these guys start getting a little bit more desperate. They're starting to cut themselves. They're raving and ranting, and nothing happens. Now, I think at this point, Elijah gets a little bit too excited and likes to show off a little bit. Because then in verse 30 through 35, it says that Elijah said to the people, come near to me. And all the people came near to him. And he repaired the altar of the Lord that had been thrown down. Elijah took 12 stones according to the number of the tribes of the sons of Jacob, to whom the word of the Lord came, saying, Israel shall be your name. And with the stones he built in the altar in the name of the Lord, he made a trench about the altar, as great as would contain 2 sheets of seed. And he put the wood in order and cut the bowl into pieces, and laid it on the wood, and said, fill 4 jars with water, and pour it on the burnt offerings and on the wood. And he said, do it a second time. And they did it a second time. And he said, do it a third time. And they did it a third time. And the water ran around the altar and filled the trench also with water. So, brothers and sisters, it's Elijah's turn now to offer and have God burn this cow, this tribute. And he's telling them to, first, let's douse it with water. And they fill it up with so much water that the trenches get filled. So now there's this giant puddle around it. Now, if anyone's ever gone camping, or if you've ever had set up a little fire pit in your backyard, you know that you don't want to use wet wood to start this fire. It makes it a little bit difficult just to get things started. It's not impossible, but you're asking for a challenge. And Elijah really got confident in this. He's like, okay, you know what? I'm going to show off a little bit. And then in verse 37, he says, answer me, O Lord, answer me, that this people may know that you, O Lord, are God, and that you have turned their hearts back. When the fire of the Lord fell and consumed the burnt offering, and the wood and the stones and the dust had licked up the water that was in the trench. So even God shows off his power a little bit here, because after Elijah had said his prayer and God answered, he had not only consumed that burnt offering, but also the wood, the stones, the dust, and even the water was gone. So nothing was left. And this is probably a big high and a big spiritual moment for Isaiah. I think the closest I could probably compare it to is when I got baptized, I felt invincible, so to speak. I felt saved. I felt grateful that I get to have this new life with Jesus. And Elijah, I keep getting those names mixed up. I don't know why. But Elijah, he's doing the same thing. He's like, look, my God just evaporated everything. There's nothing left. I can do anything. All right. He's at this great moment in his life. And continue. Now, so if I was one of these spectators just watching it all happen, I would have been sold if the burnt offering, that cow was already, lit on fire. The fact that, everything is just gone, that is truly an amazing feat. Like I would have been sold for life. Okay, you got the real God here. I'm goodbye ball. And so during this high and this excitement, Elijah tells or sends all 450 of the prophets of Baal to be executed, because everybody agrees that, our God is the one true God. And unfortunately, Queen Jezebel, she gets this news and isn't really too happy about it. But before, I just want to recap that, like, during the time that God had used Elijah, he had declared a drought and survived all 3 years. He was able to multiply the oil and flour for not only himself, but for the widow and her son. She had brought the widow's sons back from the dead. And now he just was part of this big contest where 400 people said, you're worshiping the wrong God. And he won. And so this is at an all-time high for Elijah. This is an all-time high for him. He should be excited. He should feel like nothing can stop him. And when Queen found out about this, she sends people out to kill him. And the very next day, while he's running for his life, in 1 Kings 19:4, it says, but he himself went a day's journey into the wilderness and came and sat down under a broom tree. And he asked that he might die, saying, it is enough now, O Lord, take away my life, for I am no better than my fathers. So Elijah, a mighty prophet, faced the depths of burnout after just this victorious confrontation, right? He's exhausted. He thought he just won the battle. He thought he just saved his people, and they're coming out to kill him, and he's exhausted. And at this time, his faith really and his strength should have been at its peak. He found himself fleeing into the wilderness, overwhelmed, and even discerning, and he was ready to die. His story reminds us that even the most devout prophets and servants can experience moments of despair and fatigue. How many times have we thought that, hey, I'm doing the right thing, everything's going well for me, And the initial comeback or reaction to it was not what we expected. And so, but after hearing his prayer to say, hey, I want to die, I've had enough, I can't do this anymore. Continuing in verses 5 through 8, it says, and he lay down and slept under a broom tree. And behold, an angel touched him and said to him, arise and eat. And he looked, and behold, there was at his head a cake baked on hot stone and a jar of water. And he ate and drank and lay down again. And the angel of the Lord came again a second time and touched him and said, arise and eat, for the journey is too great for you. And he arose and he ate and drank. And when the strength of the food of that food 40 days and 40 nights to Horeb, the mountain of God. And so after hearing Elijah's prayer to die, God sends an angel, and he essentially says, look, you don't want to die. You're just hungry. And, so cake is actually referring to like a loaf of bread, if anyone didn't know that. So he gave him a loaf of bread and some water and rest and lay down. And again, same thing. After he woke up, he had some more bread, he had some more water, and he continued on for another 40 days and 40 nights. Brothers and sisters, we can accomplish great things. And even though we can accomplish great things, it doesn't mean we don't get tired. It doesn't mean we don't feel it in ourselves. Or it's just, you know what, God, I need a break. I don't want to do this anymore. I quit. I'm not that good. And we can endure things like droughts and pandemics, but rest assured to know that, God can provide us the nourishment that we need, and will continue to provide us nourishment when we are down. And then after 40 days and 40 nights, Elijah went into the cave on Mount Horeb. And while hiding in this cave, as mentioned here in 1 Kings chapter 19, verses 11 through 14, it says that it says the following. And he said, go out and stand on the mount before the Lord. And behold, the Lord passed by, and a great strong wind tore the mountains and broke in pieces the rocks before the Lord. But the Lord was not in the wind. And after the wind, an earthquake, but the Lord was not in the earthquake. After the earthquake, a fire, but the Lord was not in the fire. And after the fire, the sound of a low whisper. And when Elijah heard it, he wrapped his face in his cloak and went out and stood at the entrance at that cave. And behold, there came a voice to him. He said, what are you doing, Elijah? He said, I have been very jealous of the Lord, the God of hosts, for the people of Israel have forsaken your covenant, thrown down your altars, and killed your prophets with the sword. And I, even I, only am left, and they seek my life to take away. So even though it's been 40 days and 40 nights after this big contest, this big challenge to the 450 prophets of Baal, the people of Israel were still not happy with him and still wanted him to go. And this really discouraged Elijah. But what we can get from here is that even though, while he was on Mount Horeb, the winds tore down these rocks into pieces, there were earthquakes and fires, God wasn't there. God was there when everything was finally quiet. And what Elijah can show us is that even when we are stressed, when we feel like the world is falling apart within our own eyes, we can take time in those moments of peace to just rest and go to the Lord and ask for help. Go to him to give us the strength and the guidance that we need. And Elijah kind of reminds me of this story I once heard. There was a preacher going through some hard times, recently had some surgery and going through some illness. And one Sunday evening, he goes to his wife and he says, "I'm going to retire. This was my last sermon." And his wife responds and says, "Well, how about you just sleep on it?" And so that's what he does. He lays down and goes to bed. And by Monday morning, as soon as he wakes up, he's ready and he's excited to get his next sermon put together. And he even goes to a few of his other closer brothers and sisters and he says that he needs help and he needs support. And continue encouraging him. And his brothers and sisters did continue to encourage him, and eventually he kept on going. He didn't end up retiring at all and is still preaching. And like Elijah, God himself will either come to you or he will send someone to encourage you and to continue on, to do what is right. So enough about Elijah. The next person that I'd like to talk about is the Apostle Paul. Paul addresses a sense of weariness many times. And if anybody's ever felt burnt out, it was definitely him. In 2 Corinthians chapter 11, verses 23 through 29, he says, "Are they servants of Christ? Am I better one? Am I a better one? Am I taking like a madman with far greater labors, far more imprisonments, with countless beatings and often near death? 5 times I received at the hands of the Jews 40 lashes less 1. 3 times I was beaten with rods. Once I was stoned. 3 times I was shipwrecked. A day and a night I was adrift at sea. On frequent journeys, in danger from rivers, danger from robbers, danger from my own people, danger from Gentiles, danger in the city, danger in the wilderness, danger in the sea, danger from false brothers, in toil and hardships, though many a sleepless night, in hunger and thirst, often without food, in cold and exposure. And apart from other things, there is the daily pressure on me of my anxiety for all of the churches. Who is weak? And I am not weak, and am I not weak? Who is made to fall? And am I not indigent?" And so the Apostle Paul, he bore the weight of spreading the gospel to the ends of the earth. And his tireless efforts were accomplished through these hardships, through these challenges and moments of weariness. And yet, in the midst of his struggles, Paul found profound wisdom in his weakness, recognizing that it is precisely in our own limitations that God's power finds its fullest expressions. In 2 Corinthians verse 7, he starts talking about this thorn. And in verse 9 through 10, he says, "But he said to me, my grace is sufficient for you, for my power is made perfect in weakness. Therefore, I will boast all the more gladly of my weakness, so that the power of Christ may rest upon me. For the sake of Christ, then, and I am content with weakness, insults, hardships, persecutions, and calamities. For when I am weak, then I am strong." And so in this passage, Paul shares his experience receiving this thorn of the flesh, a source of suffering that humbled him. And when he pleaded with God to remove it, God's responded with the revelation that his grace is sufficient. Paul realizes that his weakness became the canvas upon which God's strength was displayed. Instead of being limited, Paul embraces them, knowing that his weakness in Christ, that in his weaknesses, Christ's powers could manifest more gloriously. In this specific passage, I think about it in my own personal life. I know many of y'all can see that I have all these rings and stuff on my hands, and I deal with a lot of physical pain. every day in my life. And I'll be honest, I can't wait for the day that I'm up in heaven and I don't have to wear these rings and I'm not in this constant pain. My hands feel free and normal. And I think of it like Paul, where even though I might be in a physical pain, knowing that one day I'm going to be up in heaven and I'm going to, not feel this pain anymore. I'm going to be with God. He'll share, having his grace is enough. Hopefully, I like to think that, I'm still standing here. I get to preach in front of y'all. Sometimes I don't think I'm the best, but I like to try to be an example that God is always there and that the stuff we go through in this world is temporary. In Galatians chapter 6, verses 9 and 10, it says, "And let us not grow weary of doing good, for in due season we will reap if we do not give up. So then, as we have opportunity, let us do good in everyone, and especially to those who are of the household of faith." So, in Paul's words to the Galatians, with the call to preserve the face of weariness, he acknowledges that the road of righteousness can be taxing, and yet he exhorts believers to continue doing good works. He says basically, let us not lose heart in doing good, because when you lose heart, you give up. And when you get tired of all and you quit, it is called compassion fatigue. It's well-doers burn out. It's well-doers burn out. And so it is something that can affect each and every person. Right? After we've been through a lot of stress, after we've gone through enough, we want to just kind of say, hey, God, I'm tired. I want to go to bed. I don't want to do anything. And, here in Galatians, Paul says, don't give up. Just keep doing the good work, because I promise everything will work out. And so, to sort of kind of recap everything that I've mentioned, the first thing I want to say is that from Elijah, we learned that we want to prioritize rest. Just as God provided rest for Elijah, we must prioritize physical and spiritual rest to ensure that we recharge our bodies and our souls. We want to seek God's presence. In moments of weariness, we want to seek God's presence through prayer, through meditation, and through studying his word. We want to embrace our weaknesses. Like Paul, acknowledge our weakness and allow God's strength to shine through them. And we want to preserve in well-doing. Let Paul's words echo in our hearts, that we don't get weary in doing good, and that our efforts will live faithfully and serve God and will bear the fruits of the Spirit. In Revelations chapter 3, verse 20, it says, "Behold, I stand at the door and knock. If anyone hears my voice and opens the door, I will come in to him and eat with him, and he with me." So navigating through the challenges of life, both physically and spiritually, let's open a door to our hearts and to the Savior who stands outside, offering renewal, restoration, and strength. Just as Elijah found renewal through God's presence, and just as Paul had discovered strength through his weakness, we too can experience a profound transformation when we allow Jesus into our lives. And so, brothers and sisters, if maybe you're feeling a little tired and maybe you're ready to re-energize yourself and you haven't done so yet, the water's right there. It looks pretty full to me, so don't worry. And if you already took that plunge, though, and you yourself are in need of that water and that encouragement, I ask that you please all come forward as we stand and sing this song of encouragement.